Welcome to another uh, Grazing Club webinar. This is part two with Dr. Fred Provenza. Last week we did part one, which was focused on change and how to embrace change and understanding that change is probably the only constant in the universe. And so check that out. Today, part two, we're going to be talking about how palates link animals with landscapes. So my name is Michael Thiele. I'm Grazing Club Coordinator for the Manitoba Grazing Clubs. And this winter, we're going to do a number of webinars, and we're lucky to have Dr. Fred Provenza with us to do this series over the course of the winter. Fred is Professor Emeritus, Department of Wildland Resources, Utah State University. And like I said, today we're going to discuss how grazing animals link or palates link animals with landscapes, which will be more of like a discussion embracing complexity and diversity. So with that, I'll let Fred get started. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's truly is a pleasure, as I've been saying to you, to be here with you and to be here with the other folks in the audience. And last week we said we'll just put this 5-part series under this broad topic of how palates link animals with landscapes. And we started out last week talking about the only constant. And it may seem strange, why would you start out on a grazing conference talking about change as the only constant? But as we said last week, trying to think about how systems are changing ecologically, socially, economically, and that is the only constant, can give a kind of a philosophical background to think about the topics that we're going to discuss. And so today, we want to focus on Let Feed Be Thy Medicine, which is really going to talk more about livestock and their nutrition and health. And then next week, we'll move on to focus more on how our nutrition and health is linked with the health of plant diversity, soils, the health of livestock. And so that'll be under the topic of Let Food Be Our Medicine. And then we'll move on from there to which we can talk more about this. We're going to make the argument that there's a wisdom to the body and that all creatures from insects to human beings have this wisdom, but that wisdom has been hijacked. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, how that wisdom's been hijacked, but even more so as we move on related to our nutritional wisdom. And then we'll end up talking about these transformations of consciousness that go along with trying to embrace change ecologically, economically, socially, and so forth. So let's move on to this Let Feed Be Thy Medicine. And let me provide just a little bit of background, Michael, related to both feed and food as medicine by making a couple of points here. First, if you think about it, and you and I were talking prior to this presentation here about wild animals and our love for wild animals, and when we were young, growing up, fishing and hunting and those sorts of things. And if you think about these creatures, nobody has to tell any wild creature, whether it's a bacteria or a protozoa or insects, fish, birds, mammals, how and what to eat, develop and replicate. They know how to do that. And that may sound, oh, well, yeah, of course they do. But as you go into that, you realize that they've figured out a lot of things, how to maintain their health nutritionally, how to medicate themselves when they get sick, and so forth. And so we want to explore some of those topics today. I think it's interesting that even the, quote, lowly laboratory rat, if you give them choices, put them in different states of deficiency, for instance, make them deficient in magnesium or a particular amino acid, and then give them a range of choices, they are able to figure out what food meets their needs for the deficiency and to rectify that deficiency. I think it's really interesting too that when people make rats diabetic, type 2 diabetic and then offer them choices of foods, they will avoid high carbohydrate diets and move over to diets that are high in protein and fat, which is what many of the folks, doctors that I interact with nowadays who treat diabetes are strongly recommending get off of the ultra processed diets and move on to diets that are higher in protein and fat, which would be meat and vegetables basically. But rats don't have to be told that, right? They don't have to go to their doctor to figure that out. So, during the 50 years I spent involved in this stuff, I was really interested in goats and sheep and cattle and wildlife species, just obsessed with wildlife species, and really interested in what they eat. And I loved plants and diverse arrays of plants and that were growing on rangelands and in the mountains around where I lived, and was really interested. Why do they eat what they eat, and what is it that they eat? Well, when I went to Utah State University and started to work more formally on food selection and nutrition of animals, you come to realize there's really a lot of challenges that animals face in trying to select their diet from this diverse array of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. We know that some species and plant parts are nutritious and others can be toxic if they're eaten too much. We also know that individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending on the time of day, the week, and the season. That is to say that it's a moving target. The nutrients and the toxins in plants are changing really kind of minute to minute and as a function of the environment and on the resources available in the environment where the plant's growing. So we know then that plants are responding biochemically to sunlight, moisture, nutrients, to other plants and herbivory. I've said a lot in that sentence, and it summarizes probably 50, 60, 70 years of studies by plant people who study plants and study plant biochemistry. So I did that plants are responding moment to moment to their environment. They're not just passively living in an environment, they're actively involved in that. And then we know that herbivores respond to the chemical characteristics of plants. And that's what we want to talk more about as we go along here today. So the first question I would pose then to think about is, how do wild and domestic animals, domestic too, know how to meet their needs for nutrients and medicines? They don't have nutritionists or pharmacists or veterinarians within their family groups and herds that are telling them what to do. So how is it that they know how to do that? And I guess of equal importance to us is, what does that mean for the way that we manage animals and low-cost ways to try to manage animals? If we understand their abilities and then understand how we can hijack those abilities at great cost, then what are the implications for us, basically? And this will be a topic for next time, but just to set the stage, we humans face challenges in foraging as well. Our ancestors' challenges were much more like the challenges that herbivores, wild and domestic herbivores on landscapes face. Well, nowadays, we still face tremendous challenges. The nutrient content of foods, at least here in the US, you look like at that basket of foods there in the upper right, and they all look great. But as we well know, they may or may not taste good at all. And going to argue as we go along, if there's no flavor to them, if there's no richness of flavor, that's telling you, your body is telling you immediately that the nutrient content of this food is not good. It's as simple as that in many ways. So the challenge of finding nutritious food, we still have that. The toxins in foods, nowadays one could argue basically that ultra processed foods that are high in refined carbohydrates, super high, are really toxins. They're just slow acting toxins. So we've got a toxin challenge that's still present, but different from back in the day. So and this spatial and temporal variability, you know, that those tomatoes there may or may not taste good as a function of the environment where they've been growing, when they were picked, and so forth. These are all topics we'll get into next week, but just trying to set the stage and trying to say too, then, to consider this irony. You know, here, wild and domestic animals can go out on a landscape and basically figure out what it is that they need to eat to meet their needs for nutrients and for medicines as well. But we people have to be told by authority figures all the time what and what not to eat. And those of us who've been alive very long at all realize that we were told was nutritious yesterday is we're told is toxic today. What we were told is toxic yesterday, we're told to eat today. So this advice is constantly changing. And, you know, we're going to come around to that next week and the following week about how do you tap into the wisdom of your own body. And then for today, thinking about how do we allow the animals in our care to tap into the wisdom of their bodies, and what is that wisdom? So I would say for humans then, do we lack the ability to identify and select nourishing diets, or has that ability been hijacked? And I'm going to argue that it's been hijacked for us, and we can often hijack it for the animals in our care as well. So Michael, any thoughts at this point before we launch more formally into the topic? Just trying to set the stage basically.
Yeah, and that's going to be a nice segue for next week. But just a little story. I was watching a video on plant breeding of tomatoes, and you had a nice picture of tomatoes there. They were good-looking tomatoes. They may or may not be very nutritious. They may not be very tasty, and this documentary was quite interesting. Is back in the 70s, a mutation was found. They were looking for ways to be able to grow a tomato that was more durable, right? Durable in that it could be transported thousands of miles and last longer on the shelf. And it's not like that isn't a useful pursuit in and of itself, right? But the problem is the trade-off, and that's where the word hijack is interesting, is because what's happened is you now have a more durable tomato, but it has no nutrition or flavor. And they were showing some of the numbers, the loss of mineral density, and it was quite shocking, up to like 75% loss of things like calcium and magnesium and vitamin C and so on. So that's sort of one way where I think we've been in the pursuit of certain goals, but one of the trade-offs has been things like nutrition, which we don't buy and sell based on the nutrient density of things. So we've been oriented maybe to make poor decisions just because a tomato is a tomato, and which isn't always the case, right?
Absolutely. That's a perfect example. It makes me think too of some friends in Florida. Man named Harry Cleese and the program that he's running there, where they've recognized this, and this is over several years now, that recognize these issues, and they're really trying now to think much more about flavor and nutrient density, not only the primary nutrients, energy, protein, minerals, and so forth, but all these rich array of phytochemicals, the tannins, terpenes, alkaloids. We'll talk more about those today, and realizing that all that contributes to the flavor and then the nutritional quality of the plant. So they have programs going where they're trying now to select for tomatoes, in this case here, and strawberries, but tomatoes is one they're really focusing on, for varieties that really are better able to really meet our needs in terms of flavor and nutritional quality. So a really good example you brought in there.
Good.
Okay, should we roll into this then?
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about Let Feed Be Thy Medicine. And I want to start out with some food for thought questions. 45 years ago, I wasn't here in the office. I was in this office. I was down in southern Utah. My wife and I were down there, and we were working with goats. And we were using the goats to prune this shrub blackbrush, which is the shrub in these pictures here. And the idea was that historically they ran a lot of goats in that country and they ran a lot of cattle in that country. And the goats will prune this shrub back and they'll stimulate they'll stimulate a lot of new growth. That shrub there that's in the center of the picture with all the green on it, that's a shrub that has grown following browsing during the winter. It grew like mad during the spring. And we knew from work that other people had done that those new twigs are higher in energy, protein, minerals than that older, woodier growth. So that was the idea. Let's use the goats to prune the shrub in the winter, and then it'll make better winter range for wildlife species, deer, bighorn sheep, and also cattle. They run cattle. This may amaze ranchers, and it gets you realizing cows aren't cows aren't cows, and goats aren't goats aren't goats. Where those animals are born and reared, which is a topic we'll get into as we go along, really influences their ability to utilize landscape. So they run cattle down there in winter, and I've never seen a cattle put their head down and mow brush like that. Coming from Colorado, a ranch I was on, I wasn't used to that. And it opened my eyes to the fact cattle can be browsers. So anyway, that was the idea of the program. But the interesting part was that after we'd done that first winter's browsing, had this new growth, what we learned was that the goats don't want to eat the new growth. They very strongly prefer to eat the old woody twigs rather than the new twigs. So that was a question right off the bat. What's going on here? Why are they doing that? As we went along, and this was many, many years later, but it's a food for thought that ties in with it, we found that if we supplemented goats with this compound polyethylene glycol, and that isn't antifreeze, they're different compounds. A lot of people say, oh, if you're giving them antifreeze, that's not. We give them a little bit of polyethylene glycol, now they love to eat the new twigs. And we were working with friends over in Israel who were working with sheep and cattle and goats, and we were working with goats here in the US. And, you know, we were showing in all those cases with all those species that you could change preference for plants like blackbrush if you supplemented with polyethylene glycol. So why would that be the case? What's going on there? How can a little supplement totally change preference for something that animals don't want? I also observed during that first winter down there in southern Utah, my wife and I built 2 miles of fence there in 110-degree temperatures during the summer. It's a wonder our marriage survived that, but we did that. And then we set up 6 pastures basically, and we had 15 goats on each one of those pastures. And these goats here that are in this picture, and it was a 2.5 acre pasture. They started to eat wood rat houses. That's at the base of that juniper tree is a big wood rat house. Now, blackbrush is bad, but that wood rat house looks even worse. And yet that group of goats started to eat wood rat houses. So the question is, why did the goats start eating wood rat houses specifically? And if you've paid much attention to animals, why do they sometimes eat very unusual kinds of foods? That's the general question. So I've got one last food for thought for you. And this one came several years into the program once we were getting known for the work that we were doing, and people were then sending us lots of questions about things, food selection, the ranchers I'm talking about here. And this was a particularly interesting letter from a man named Mick Holder. He's a rancher in Arizona, he was. And he started the letter something like this. He said, in 30 years of ranching, I never once lost a cow to poisonous plants, even though there are plenty of poisonous plants on my rangelands. He said, but then we got into a severe drought. And the thing that seemed best for me to do was to split my herd. And I left half of them in Hia County, which is where they were born and raised in the landscape they were familiar with. He said, I moved the other half of them to Apache County. And he said, I suffered severe losses with the cattle I moved to Apache County, even though it's the same poisonous plants, both counties. It's not like there's different plants that are down there. So the question he was posing to us was simply this: why did the cattle in Apache County eat those poisonous plants and die from them, whereas the ones left in Hia County did not, and they'd never suffered any losses? So with those by way of food for thoughts, let's move more into this topic. Now, when I was first working with the goats in southern Utah, and I went back and told some of my professors what I was seeing, I'll never forget, I was talking to one toxicologist, old fellow, who greatly admired in the animal science department. I said, tell him about the goats. He looked at me and he said, well, I guess that just goes to show domestic animals lack nutritional wisdom, doesn't it? And I didn't know what to say to him at the time, and I don't even know why I didn't believe it, but I never believed that that was true. But I didn't have any way to argue with him at that point, so I was just quiet. I didn't say, probably say, yeah, I guess so. But, you know, it illustrates a point. At that point, which was 45 years ago, amongst animal nutritionists, toxicologists, anybody working in the animal sciences, range sciences area, the view was that wild animals obviously had nutritional wisdom. They must have it. Otherwise, how could they survive on these landscapes? But the notion was that as a result of 10,000 years of domestication, we had bred that ability out of domestic animals. And there were a few studies that had been done where they challenged animals to try to select a diet when they were deficient. I'm thinking of one or two of them, one with cattle, one with sheep, and the animals didn't do what the nutritionists thought they should. So from that point on, it was just like, you know, domestic animals clearly don't have nutritional wisdom. So what I'm going to argue today is that those studies, as they were done, certainly were valid, but they absolutely ignored what it means for an animal to have nutritional wisdom and how nutritional wisdom actually works in animals. And so that's what we want to explore here today, and then we'll move into that more as we go on in a week from now. So there are three legs to a stool, I guess we could say, when it comes to nutritional wisdom. And if you break any one of those legs, you're not going to see nutritional wisdom manifest. If you break all three of those legs, as we often do with domestic animals and with humans as well, then it's a total, the whole thing has been hijacked. And so those legs are first, plant diversity. You know, if animals don't have a diverse array of different plant species to select from, the more we restrict them, the more we put them in a box, and that ability cannot be manifest. That was part of the problem with the trials that people had run. So there's that leg to the stool. But there's also this social cultural leg that has been totally ignored. This idea that animals began to learn dietary habits in the womb through flavors in amniotic fluid of what mom's eating. Then after birth, through flavors in mother's milk. And with mother as a model of what and what not to eat, where and where not to go to find forages. There's just a rich literature that's developed around that topic. And we come to realize how fundamentally important it is for animals, for this wisdom of the body, and for animals to be locally adapted to the landscapes they inhabit. Last week, we alluded to this idea about fossil fuels and how to get out of fossil fuel loops, and we want to just keep burrowing in on that idea. And this idea of locally adapted animals that know how to utilize landscapes just becomes fundamentally important for getting out of fossil fuel loops. So that's the second leg to the stool. The third leg is the one we're going to actually start on today, and that's the leg that allows each individual, then given a diverse array of choices, given mother as a model to help it get started in life, these flavor feedback interactions are become fundamentally important in terms of the body's own wisdom. And what that is simply that animals, the body, the wisdom of the body is automatically associating the flavor of food with feedback. And this feedback is coming from cells and organ systems, including the microbiome that everybody likes to talk about so much nowadays. That's where the feedback's coming from, is these cells and organ systems. If you think about where does food go? It's interesting to ask people that, because sometimes, a lot of times you don't even think about it. Where does food go? Well, it goes into the stomach and then it gets digested. And then all these phytochemicals and biochemicals get into the bloodstream. And via capillaries, they go to cells. And it's these cells then that have to have their needs met. And the feedback is then coming from cells and organ systems through hormones, neurotransmitters. We're not going to go into those details, though we've written several papers that did go into those details and talked about, well, what is feedback and how is feedback working? For the level we're going now, we just need to know that feedback is important. It's changing liking for the flavor of food as a function of need. So that's basically what we want to talk about here today and how that works. And I'll have to say, when I was working on the ranch 50 years ago now, interested in food selection, I had not a clue of flavor feedback and how that even existed or how that worked. And it was pretty amazing, as I'll try to illustrate as we go along, to learn about that happened, and that is a basis for nutritional wisdom. But that's also the basis, if you're in the food industry, for how you can hijack that system. So if I were to ask any of you why you like a particular food, you'd tell me you like it because it tastes good. And if I asked you why you didn't like a particular food, you'd tell me because it tastes bad. And that's exactly right. That it's taste, the flavor, the taste and odor of food that we're keying into. And it's neat because the body simplified this tremendous complexity that goes on at a cellular level between cells and organ systems, among cells and organ systems, and the tens of thousands of compounds that get into the body during a meal. That complexity is amazingly overwhelming, but the body simplifies it for us. It just does it taste good or doesn't it taste good? That's all a body needs to know and respond to. But we want to go a little bit more into depth on that. And so I'm going to say flavor is fundamental to it, but that flavor, our liking for flavor, is changing as a function of feedback, and that feedback is coming from these primary and secondary compounds. So palatability is more than a matter of taste. Now, the primary compounds are energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and so forth. And these secondary compounds are this vast array of compounds that I didn't know a thing about until we got involved with this work with goats. And then that whole world opened up to me. But they come under broad classes like phenolics, terpenes, alkaloids. Here's a few examples for you of plants that have these different compounds in them. And you could take for your particular place, and if you sent me a list of 10 species, I could, if I didn't know what kinds of compounds they had in them, I could look that up for you, odds are. So we've got this diverse array of these secondary compounds as well. And I want to make the point, there's tens of thousands of these compounds in a plant. Take sagebrush, for instance. If you look at the number of terpenes in sagebrush, it's hundreds of different kinds of terpenes. So like everything in nature, it's incredibly complex. When we talk about tannins, the tannins in trefoil are different from the tannins in sandpoint, and they're different from the tannins in bitterbrush. The structures differ, the functions differ. And the same thing is true for any kind of compound. Alkaloids, broad class of compounds. Endophyte-infected tall fescue is high in alkaloids. Many plants have alkaloids, but again, that same point. The structures, the kinds of alkaloids vary from plant to plant, and then within a plant, there'll be a diverse array. For instance, one of the plants that we worked with a lot when I was at Utah State was local weed was one that has alkaloids, but larkspur was another one. There's 20, 30 different alkaloids in tall larkspur. and they vary in their toxicity to animals. And so what I'm trying to paint here is this picture that there's this tremendous complexity, and feedback is coming from this tremendous complexity. And the body, it's a miracle. If you think about it, the body is able to integrate all of this information, and then it sums it up to us in terms of, do you like the taste of the food or don't you like the taste of the food? It's as simple as that in one sense. So as relates to the question, that the statement that my friend the toxicologist said, well, that goes to show domestic animals don't have nutritional wisdom, doesn't it? So I thought for a long time, well, how would I demonstrate to these professors that animals do actually have nutritional wisdom? And my graduate student friends and I would sit and talk about that, and it was actually quite baffling to us. Well, how do you show that? The best way we came up with was actually like this. We decided, well, okay, what if you make an animal nutrient deficient, make them mildly deficient in a particular nutrient, not extremely deficient, just mild. That could be energy, protein, minerals, whatever it is. I'm going to show you a video where we did it with energy as part of a workshop, a 2-week short course we used to take. So let's say, so what we would do then on odd days, and we did this with sheep for that workshop, we would feed the sheep apple flavored straw, one group of sheep apple flavored straw, another group of sheep maple flavored straw. After the meal, we would take a stomach tube and put water directly into their gut. Now that only makes sense in relation to what we did on even days. Now we switch the flavors, but after they eat the meal, we drench them, but now the water has the nutrient in it that they're lacking. So the idea is, look, if they're acquiring preferences for flavor based upon feedback that's coming from the nutrients at a cellular level, then animals in group 1 should strongly prefer maple to apple, and animals in group 2 should strongly prefer apple to maple. And that's exactly what we found. And it's been so many years now that we did the first study, and then literally probably hundreds of studies after that. But I can still recall walking down, we had 24 animals, 12 in group 1, 12 in group 2, and walking down that line of animals and looking in their feed boxes, and you absolutely knew which animals had the nutrient associated with maple and which ones had it with apple, because that was what was gone. That was what they ate from the two choices, the 2-choice food box. So in testing, we'd give them a choice between apple and maple. Now, let me show you, hopefully that makes sense, because it's powerful. And once you see that, you realize the power of feedback to alter liking for flavor, which is what we were showing. Now, let me show you how that looks with a group of, this was at a short course that we were teaching, and the people at the short course were actually doing the work. And in this case here, we have 2 small groups of sheep. One group, after they ate straw, was drenched with an energy solution. The other group was simply drenched with water. And you'll see one group loves straw, the other group can't figure out what's going on. So the one group loves straw, and the other group isn't interested at all. And it's simply the feedback that's altered their liking for the flavor of straw. So when we were doing that work back many, many years ago, I came across this quote from Dave Barry. He says, what are calories? He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature, so we have a way to get onion dipped into our mouths at parties, has none. If you add the feedback term to that, he's absolutely nailed that. And that's what people, this is jumping ahead to where we're going next week. This is what people in industry have figured out, is that if you really want to condition strong preferences for the flavors of foods, you link familiar flavors with refined carbs, these ultra processed kind of foods, to lure people to the novel food by dressing it in a known and liked flavor and reinforcing the flavor with a blast of energy, which is basically what we did there with those sheep. Now, we didn't just work with energy in the studies that we did. We started with energy because we figured if you can't condition a preference with energy, you're probably not going to condition it with anything else. So we started with energy, and we worked with energy in a whole bunch of different forms, everything from cellulose, which is the cell walls of plants, to starch, which would be in grain diets, to glucose, which starch is converted in, and these cellulose and starch are converted into glucose, which is converted into these volatile fatty acids. If you're into nutrition and ruminant nutrition, you know about the volatile fatty acids. And in every case, we were able to condition preferences based on feedback. We went on to work with protein, everything from non-protein nitrogen to ruminally degradable nitrogen to bypass protein. If you have an idea what that is, if you don't, it doesn't matter so much. But protein conditions preferences too when animals have a need for protein. And then we looked at energy protein ratios and the rates at which they ferment relative to one another, because we know from nutrition studies that the ratio of protein to energy matters a great deal to animals depending upon their physiological state. Are they pregnant? Are they lactating? Are they dry? Whatever, all that. Do they have a parasite load? Parasite load, their need for protein relative to energy goes up and so forth. So just trying to say that we looked at many, many variations on energy and protein and ratios. We went on to work with minerals, all those that are shown there. And when animals are deficient in minerals, they'll form a strong preference. When they're conditioned, just as I was showing you, they'll form a strong preference for the flavor of straw that was followed by feedback from the mineral. We had friends in Australia who went on to show the same kind of thing with vitamin E. So there's plenty of evidence then that post-ingestive feedback from primary compounds matters. We also did a tremendous amount of work with these so-called secondary compounds. And at the time we started that work in ecology, there was a general thought that these secondary compounds were mainly what they did was to deter animals from eating plants. And certainly they do that. They in high concentrations, phenolics, alkaloids, terpenes, are feeding deterrents. And so they'll make plants unpalatable. And we'll often talk about them as these weed species that animals won't eat. Well, it's very likely that they're very high in secondary compounds. So that influenced how we were thinking. And what I want to say here is that everything depends on the dose. When we worked with these secondary compounds in modest to small amounts, dosages, then we found they could actually cause animals to form preferences for foods. And so that idea relates more generally then to both primary and secondary compounds. There was an old toxicologist, an ancient one, that said, everything is a toxin. It all depends upon the dose. If you have too much energy or protein or minerals, you can poison animals. All those things every compound is toxic. It depends on the dose. And as I'm going to go on to say, it depends on relationships, interrelationships between foods with these different kinds and amounts of secondary compounds. So, liking for food depends upon how adequate the food is. And it really relates more to the combinations of foods that are in the diet. And then does the food cause deficiencies or excesses, the diet, or the foods cause deficiencies or excesses? Michael, I've been talking yep. Like the talking head.
Yeah.
Do you, just trying to lay the background here, we'll go into some practicalities, but are there comments that you'd like to make at this point?
Well, this is fascinating that, a lot of this, whether it's a grazing animal or us, humans, that a lot of this is happening kind of at an unconscious level, right? That it comes back from a cellular level all the way up into our, you know, ultimately into our consciousness, but it's all happening in the background, and we're not really, we're not responsible for our behaviors in that sense. And then smart people have figured out how to hijack that process. And, like the fast food industry is a great example of that, right? That our preferences for things like energy and protein and salt and fat, the things that are in our distant past were always limiting, right? And when you were able to find some of it, you just wanted to get as much of it as you could to survive for another day. And that whole process is happening unconsciously, and that it's been hijacked kind of in our modern world, right?
Absolutely. Perfect points, Michael. And I hadn't mentioned that very important point that you're mentioning. It is all happening at a non-conscious, non-cognitive, non-conscious kind of level. I often ask people, how many of you are thinking about which enzymes to release to digest the meal you just ate? And people laugh, and occasionally one person will raise their hand, but we all know we don't do that. And it's the point you're making. It's the same thing with this. And in fact, we did studies when I was in Australia years ago, where we offered animals a food and then put them in deep, deep anesthesia during the time that the feedback occurred. We actually administered a toxin dose. I'll say just a bit more about that here. And so during the time that feedback occurred, they were deeply, deeply anesthetized. Well, then when they came to a week or so later, we tested them. They still acquired a strong aversion to the food. That is to say, you don't have to be awake to feedback occurs, and they think a large meal is often followed by muscular relaxation, drowsiness, sleep, and yet feedback is still altering our liking for the food. So a really key point that you're making, and then linking it in so nicely with the other points.
Yeah, so it's just, I guess now, we could talk about the livestock side of that too as well, right? How we've maybe hijacked all that.
Right, and that's
the
where we want
process
to
of
go.
feeding lives, and that's where we're going to go. Is the fact that we've been sort of oriented to figure out how to do how to feed animals cheaply, economically, efficiently, all that. But there are trade-offs.
Absolutely, and as you and I both agreed last week, and we've alluded to this week, when we talk about some of the things we mentioned, it's not by way of criticism, it's more by way of reflection on, we've been thinking about things a particular way, and I'm sure if anybody even cares about what we're talking about 20 years from now, they may say the same thing for us. But, it's as we learn more and more about these systems, and as you said at the beginning, the incredible complexity of these systems, it gets us to thinking about things that we weren't thinking about before, and that's where let's go as we go through into this today, huh? With this by way of background, let's get into some of the implications that for a livestock producer that come out of thinking about the feedback and what that might mean.
Okay.
Before we launch into those, let's come back to our food for thought questions, to some of them anyway. And this first one about why most goats avoid eating the new growth on blackbrush absolutely relates to what ecologists were studying back 45 years ago, this whole idea of plant chemistry and secondary chemistry. And these secondary compounds serving as feeding deterrents to protect plants from being utilized. And what we were finding with the new growth of blackbrush is that the bark is 70% tannins, and the particular tannins that are in that are really strong feeding deterrents to goats. Most of them do not want to eat that new growth, and it's because of the high concentrations of tannins. So what we were finding with blackbrush fit absolutely with what ecologists were finding with many plant species. These compounds protect these new twigs. It's a big investment by the plant, right? It takes a lot of energy and nutrients and water to create that new growth. How does blackbrush deal with that? It protects that new growth from being utilized. So that's what was going on there, is that the high tannin concentration. Polyethylene glycol, what's interesting about it, it binds to tannins. It binds very strongly to tannins. So if you supplement animals with a little bit of polyethylene glycol, and that's in their rumen when they're eating these high tannin twigs, then the polyethylene glycol binds up all of those tannins. And now the feedback is positive because they're getting the feedback from the energy and protein and minerals that are in blackbrush. They're not getting the aversive feedback from the tannins, and away they go. And in fact, polyethylene glycol is a known compound, and it was used quite a lot in Africa, where their livestock deal with a lot of woody plant species that are very high in tannins, and they call it something like browse buster. Browse buster was the name they gave for some of the supplements that were high in polyethylene glycol. We worked with cattle in Kansas years ago on one of the Koch brother ranches, and there's this plant there called Sericea lespedisa that's very high in tannins, and cattle don't want to eat it. And what we were showing is that if we supplemented cattle with polyethylene glycol, then they would really readily eat the Sericea lespedisa, basically. The other food for thought was, why do goats eat wood rat houses? And the reason is that if you remove the bark, so here's these are elaborate houses actually with different chambers in them, and their vegetation, densely packed vegetation down in southern Utah, the siding, quote, siding for those houses is bark that they picked from roundabout. Well, if you scrape the bark back from those houses, you'll find that one of the rooms in the house is the toilet, basically, and it's soaked in urine and feces. And one of the goats, I'm assuming, we were living with the goats during those days, and so I watched this happen, but I didn't see the minute the goat first figured that out. But one of the goats figured out that was a supplement. They ate that, and every one of the goats in this pasture then was annihilating wood rat houses. They're just eating them all. So what was significant, though, is that urine and those feces became a non-protein nitrogen supplement that really helped. Blackbrush is low in nitrogen, these old woody twigs. And if you know much about ruminant nutrition, you know that you need to keep a certain level of nitrogen in the diet so that the bacteria in the rumen can digest this woody plant material. Well, that's what they discovered was a non-protein nitrogen supplement. And those goats, after 3 months of being on blackbrush, the goats in that pasture were in much better body condition than the goats in the other 5 pastures that didn't figure that out. And that's one of the things that has amazed me over the years, is that how animals figure out how to utilize landscapes, and then how that can become a part of the culture. So it goes way beyond genetics to the social, cultural part of what animals learn. And of 18 groups of goats during 3 winters, this group of goats was the only group of goats to figure that out. So it lets you know that animals don't inevitably figure out how to most effectively use a landscape. And when you get animals that are locally adapted and have really figured out the ins and outs of a landscape, they're valuable. That's every bit as valuable as the genetics on a particular landscape. And we'll come to that point more next week, but just to jump ahead, and that was certainly a key discovery here. Now, if we'd have wanted all the goats on our study site to be eating wood rat houses, all we would have had to do was take one of these knowledgeable goats and put it in with each of the goats in the other pastures, and there wouldn't have been a wood rat house left on Cactus Flat, basically, which is what they called the area where we were working. So more generally, why do animals eat unusual foods? These are all cases that I've either worked with or learned about. These are cattle over on Red Canyon Ranch that have discovered a mineral lick on the ranch, and they're utilizing it. Here's a pronghorn that's doing that same thing, discovered a mineral source, and they're utilizing it. These middle pictures here of these cattle are from the Netherlands. And it was a really interesting study that they did. There were three different, they had the uplands and the lowlands. And the lowlands were deficient in some minerals, phosphorus in particular. And so if they confined animals to the lowlands, they started to do really unusual behaviors. They started to dig up soil and eat the soil. If they found dead rabbits, they would eat them. If they shot rabbits and put them out for animals in the uplands versus the lowlands, the animals in the lowlands would eat them. The animals in the uplands, where they weren't mineral deficient, weren't interested in rabbits at all. You know, when we were doing studies with phosphorus and phosphorus deficiencies at the little place I showed you that video a few minutes ago, when we were doing studies of phosphorus deficiency, it was amazing because we started to see the sheep do behaviors they'd never done before. They were digging up dirt and eating the dirt like these cattle in this picture. We had one study where we had animals in individual pens adjacent to one another, and we'd randomize so that animals that were on the phosphorus deficient diet were in many cases adjacent to animals that were on the phosphorus replete diet. And what we were finding in that particular study was that when we were measuring the blood phosphorus levels, they weren't declining in the animals that were on the phosphorus deficient diet. We couldn't get them to drop. And what we came to realize watching the animals was that the animals that were on the deficient diet were eating the feces, sticking their heads through the panels and eating the feces of the animals that were on the phosphorus replete diet. And so they were getting their phosphorus from their neighbors, so to speak. And so we had to split them up so that they couldn't do that anymore. And then we got their blood phosphorus levels to drop, got them in a phosphorus deficient condition. And then when we paired a flavored food with phosphorus infusion into the rumen, then they acquired a strong preference. So, you know, animals will do very unusual behaviors, lick urine patches, eat feces, eat soil. When they're doing that, eat bones. Bones, a great example. When you see animals doing unusual things like that, they're telling us something. They're telling us that their diet isn't adequate, basically. And so that's what the person, you know, it's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're anything like that. It's simply that they're telling us their diet's deficient. So we went on then to do studies related to, we often get the question, you know, from ranchers, farmers, should we offer free choice cafeteria mineral supplements? There's a lot of possibilities for doing that. And there's several people I know that have really promoted that and that have businesses built around that. And what I tell people is this from our experience. One, we've done studies where we offered animals choices of different minerals and made them deficient, and they certainly can select the mineral that they're lacking. So our research supports that idea that they aren't just eating those things randomly, that they're responding to deficiencies in themselves. The other thing that we point out, I know it can be quite expensive to offer a wide range of different minerals to animals. And so one of the ways that we used to do things when I was in Cache Valley in northern Utah, we knew that things like copper and selenium were likely to be deficient given the geology of those sites and the plants. So rather than free choice everything, we would offer sodium, copper, and selenium to help reduce our costs. But certainly all of our work supports the idea that animals can self-select minerals to meet their needs. We worked a long time with a livestock producer in in Africa, who's well known, traveled quite a lot here in the United States, gave a lot of lectures, probably in Canada too, but certainly here in the United States, really did wonderful work. But his idea on free choice, he was very much a proponent of free choice mineral supplement. And what he thought about too is that, look, in some of my pastures where minerals are lacking, it's a way too, not only to get minerals into my animals, but when they go out and poop and pee across those landscapes, it's a way over time to get those minerals back into the system. So he was thinking in a quite holistic way, I often thought, about the role that free choice mineral cafeteria supplements can play. I can't tell you how many letters I've gotten over the years from farmers and ranchers who have gone into these programs, and their discussions and descriptions of how, well, it really depends on which pasture my live's cattle or sheep are in, which of the minerals that they'll be selecting for. And, to me, and of course, that's my belief now and my bias that animals can self-select. It just helped to reinforce how in tune animals become with their own bodies and with what's available, the choice of plants and their mineral composition that's available on the site. A last point, and then I'll let you chip in, Michael. I think we're going to talk next about plant diversity and the importance of diversity and the importance of plants where you have grasses, forbs, and shrubs that are all have different root systems, different rooting depths. They're pulling minerals from different parts of the soil profile. And, when you have this diverse array, I think the likelihood of having mineral deficiencies goes down because you have plants pulling from such a diverse array. I'm thinking of a lady in Tasmania that I've worked with who really moved in this direction of plant diversity and allowing plants to grow. And some of the mineral deficiencies that are so common in Tasmania disappeared on her place. She simply did not have those anymore. She quit supplementing, and that's unheard of there. And when I was over there looking at how so many of the plants are just grazed to ground level, so their root systems are shallow. They're really shallow, and there's not a great diversity. And you think, compared to what this lady was doing, no wonder she doesn't have issues anymore. It's because of the way she's changed her grazing. It's because of the way she's promoted plant diversity on her landscape. So that totally got her out of this very expensive feeding of supplements.
Yeah,
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, though that's very intriguing. I'm just thinking, you mentioned geology, what is in the parent material, and so we've done some work with this where we and it's not a commonly done soil test where you look at the total nutrient extraction. So that's the total amount of mineral in that. We're going down about a foot, so we're measuring that, per acre foot kind of thing is what I'm talking about. And we looked at all the macronutrients, right? NPK, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and a bunch of the micros across over 50 farms, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, North Dakota. And we didn't find a single zero in any of those measurements. In other words, there's no actual deficiency in the parent material. Like, for example, here in Manitoba, there's areas that are said to be copper deficient, that livestock have trouble, and they're typically deficient in copper. And that's correct, they are, but there is not a deficiency in the actual soil, in the parent material, and it's somehow an interaction between the geology, the soil, the biology, the plant, and the animal, right? It's complex. And when you start to correct some of those things, so just as an example, if you look at some of the numbers we saw on average over all those farms, we'll talk first about, say, like nitrogen, NPK. Nitrogen was 9,000 pounds of nitrogen just in the top foot, right? There's no deficiency in nitrogen. Phosphorus, over 2,000 pounds per acre, just in the top foot. Potassium, I think, was about 11,000 pounds. And like I said, everything down to like copper, zinc, manganese, molybdenum, even molybdenum. There was, a small amount of molybdenum that was available in that parent material. So the point of all that is there's no deficiencies as far as the mineral mineral in the soil. It's somehow not available, which has got us thinking about, well, then it's probably a biological problem. The plant, the soil biology not doing the job, because you simply have to ask yourself the question, this was basically a large pasture, the northern Great Plains, the prairies, right? It was a large,
Yes,
millions of grazing animals, diverse landscape of plants, and no one fertilized it. No one supplemented the bison, right? It's just silly
right.
to even say it. So a lot of these issues can be corrected just with a change in management.
That's so true. And I think the kind of work that you're doing across such a wide range of areas and just showing that there, in terms of the soils per se, there's no issue. That's so revealing in and of itself, because then it gets you thinking, well, what is the issue? And then you can start to think about the biology. And we know different plant species use different minerals in different ways, and uptake different minerals. And so you start to think, as you are obviously, about the biology below ground, above ground, and to me that takes us into this plant diversity part of things as well. And let's say a little bit about that, and we'll start just by I guess winding up this first part of the feedback, but it segues us then into diversity. And so we talk often for important reasons about primary compounds, energy, protein, minerals, and how they contribute to growth and health and production, and then and to overall health of immune system and so forth. And then we've got this broad array of these secondary compounds that can also serve similar kinds of roles. And when it comes to animals that are sick, and self-medication, there's really two things that we can think about and talk about. And one is that animals can self-medicate therapeutically. That is to say, if they get sick and they've learned that one of the plants that's in this picture here can make them feel better, then that's the essence of self-medication. And it's been shown in everything from insects to primates. And we certainly did a lot of work with livestock to show that they can do that. But there's this other part then that'll segue us into plant diversity, and this whole idea of prophylactically, preventatively. And so let's talk about both things. Just a second here. Let's start with this, an animal's not doing so well. Can they figure out what will help them to do better? And we certainly did a lot of research on that, and showed that animals can learn. They don't innately know necessarily, what's going to make them feel better, but they can sure learn about that. The first studies we ever did were with animals in feedlots. And we knew from all the nutrition work that had been done that when you put animals on a high grain diet, that greatly reduces the pH in their gut. They become acidotic. And we knew that things like compounds like sodium bicarb and bentonite alleviate acidosis. And so we simply asked the question, if we offered animals free choice, a medicine like sodium bicarb or bentonite, we did it with sheep and cattle, would they use it, and would it alleviate acidosis? And the answer is yes to both those questions. We went on to look at tannins. Tannins will help to reduce bloat from plants like alfalfa. The proteins that are in alfalfa that are contributing to bloat, tannins will bind those proteins up and take them down to the lower GI tract where they can be absorbed actually. But tannins will help to alleviate bloat. So we looked at that. I'd already mentioned polyethylene glycol is basically a medicine to help alleviate the effects of tannins. We looked at dicalcium phosphate for dical for oxalates when animals are on plants that have too much oxalates. We went on to look at internal parasite loads. Can animals learn to self-medicate using tannins? And then we worked with friends in Israel who were looking at combinations, tannins, terpenes, and alkaloids for internal parasites. azadirachtin for external parasites, and on and on and on. I could talk a lot about that, but the bottom line is animals can learn to self-medicate if the appropriate plants are available in the environment. And one of the last studies we did before I retired, we simply showed that they know which compounds alleviate which kind of illnesses. That is to say, acidosis obviously feels different to them than bloat from tannins, than illness that's induced by oxalates and so forth. Those are different internal states, just as a deficiency of energy or protein or minerals. However they experience that, however they're feeling that, those are different states that they get into, and then they'll learn, like we do. If we have a headache and we go to the medicine cabinet, we pick the aspirin here, or if we have a stomach ache, maybe Pepto-Bismol or whatever. The point is that they'll learn to associate specific plants with rectifying specific kinds of deficient illnesses in themselves is the bottom line to that. Let's talk. So that's the therapeutic part, and certainly good evidence that animals can do that. Let's talk prophylactically now and branch out into this idea of plant diversity and its value. And I'd like to say often that plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores below and above ground. That's pretty much captures everything I ever learned in wildlife ecology and biology, and what people are learning in terms of soils and moving away strictly from a chemical analysis of soils to the biology and the importance of biology. You know, that's what plants do. They are responsible for all life on Earth, basically, including their own. And so, to me, it's not an overstatement to say nothing is more important for health through nutrition than landscapes with variety of plants for animals. These are pictures that are taken here south of where we live in Innis in the Gravelly Range. And I've never seen such diversity on a landscape as I do on the Gravellys. They run cattle up there, and it's just, you think, boy, you talk about nutrition center and pharmacy. They're living in it, and there's cow with her calf, learning how to utilize all that diversity up there. You know, I've thought as I've gotten older, now into the 70s, a lot about the studies we and many other people did. When I was a youngster, you know, in the journals for wildlife and domestic animals, many papers were published with titles like the botanical and chemical composition of the diets of animal X under conditions Y and place Z and so forth. And we were all doing those kind of studies, documenting what are they eating and what's the chemical characteristics of those diets and so forth. And, you know, it was obvious to anybody who was doing those studies, if you followed the animals around much, certainly 3 to 5, maybe 7 plants would make up the bulk of the diet. But man, they would nibble on everything. And it could easily be 50, 75 plants in a meal. And I remember back in my more naive days, I'm still naive, but more naive days, I was, thinking like the physicists, can we predict all this stuff? Can we predict it? And you just have to follow animals around and you'd say, man, this is overwhelming. They're eating so many things. You don't even know what they're going to eat next. And if you look at 2 of them, they're not doing the same thing at all. But what I've come to feel very strongly, this is the generalization I want to make, is that 50 to 75 other plant species is probably just as important as the 3 to 5 that make up the bulk of the diet. Because what they're doing, animals are doing in eating those small amounts of such a diverse array of plants is flooding their cells with this diverse array of these phytochemicals that are best eaten in small doses, let's say. Well, then that allows cells to forage. If you think of cells as foraging, which they are, the receptor, the membrane on the cell is the brain, and it's got all these receptor sites that enables those cells to forage. If we simply think of those cells as a being, a conscious being, which they are, that allows them to forage. And so health is enhanced when livestock graze these phytochemically rich mixtures of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. And it's not just the 3 to 5 that make up the bulk of the diet, it's this tremendous diversity. And so people are showing that now. I'm tickled to see a lot of the quote younger folks that are out there around the world are starting to do studies that are saying if you have animals on a monoculture versus a two-way mixture versus five-way mixture versus more diverse, what's that do for their health? And they're showing that health is increasing physiologically, parameters they measure physiologically, nutritionally, immunologically. It's neat to see people showing those kind of responses now. Here's a study that a friend and colleague in Logan did, and showing that health improves when cattle, in this case, and they're working with sheep too, graze mixtures of plants, some of which contain tannins compared to monoculture. And they're finding that if you have different tannin-containing species, like bird's foot, trefoil, and sandfoin, and then they were working with alfalfa and brome and different species, they're finding these animals gain weight more efficiently than on a monoculture, with less emissions of greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, and they reach slaughter weights as quickly as animals in feedlots. That's saying a lot, because as you think, we're going to talk a little bit more about feedlots and that as we go along today and next week. But it has tremendous implications of what diversity of can do for the health of animals themselves. And then next week we'll talk about what that means for meat and dairy products that come from those animals, that our health gets linked to that too. So it's the health of the plant diversity, enhancing the health of soil, enhancing the health of livestock, and ultimately human beings. And then related to, as we're saying here, to changing climates. Tannins in plants, tannins and lignans help to build soil, and they help to fix carbon in soil. So these secondary compounds aren't trivial at all in terms of the whole system and how it's functioning. Biochemically diverse diets also enable sequences that complement one another. This to me is a fascinating area, and I'm going to show you a slide here in a second of some work in France, of colleagues and friends in France. But we got linked up with them in part because of our interest in how different foods can complement one another. So let's take endophyte infected tall fescue, which by all rights is a toxic plant, even though it's very common in the southeastern and eastern part of the United States, even out west. But the alkaloids in that plant are really quite nasty alkaloids, and they cause some very severe adverse effects on animals. And one of the things when we were working with people in Missouri years ago, they said you have to have diversity. You can't just put them on an alkaloid diet. And they said it helps. It helps if you have alfalfa along with fescue. What we learned that even builds on that is that if you have a tannin-containing plant, it's even better than a plant like alfalfa that contains saponins. And the reason is that the tannins in plants like trefoil and sandfoin or in woody plant species bind up those alkaloids. It's like a polyethylene glycol tannin effect. The tannins bind up the alkaloids, so the aversive effect is no longer there. That means the animals can eat more endophyte infected tall fescue with far less adverse effects. And it's this complementarity, but it's also the sequence. An appetizer of trefoil very much helps the sandfoin to go down. We found the same thing with plants like bitterbrush and sagebrush out here in the western US. An appetizer of bitterbrush, which is high in tannins, helps animals to utilize sagebrush much more effectively. And again, what we were able to show is that those tannins in the bitterbrush are binding with some of the terpenes in the sagebrush, and that enables animals to utilize more sagebrush. It's interesting, at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois, Idaho, they did a study years ago where they had several thousand sheep up there, and they wanted to select for a flock of sheep that ate sagebrush, because sagebrush has so taken over a lot of the lands in the Great Basin, throughout the Great Basin, and up into the northwestern part of the U.S. So they did that. They were able to, they looked at, did fecal analyses to see which sheep are eating the most sagebrush. And they put together a flock of sagebrush eating sheep. And everyone thought, including us, that it was physiological, which it could have been, physiological ability to utilize sagebrush. But what they came to find out through further study was that the sheep that were eating so much sagebrush had learned that appetizer of bitter brush helps the sagebrush to go down. So it was a behavioral thing, not a physiological thing. Again, that ties us back to, if you have animals that know a range and that know how to utilize a range in ways that I've already given you 2 examples, then that becomes a part of your herd that goes beyond the genetics. That's equally important to the genetics. So years ago, I was giving a talk, and a fellow came up after the talk. He said, "Your talk really helps to explain what one of the producers in our area had sworn for." And he put 4 of his daughters through college on the mix of plants that people would consider the mix of plants from hell: Sericea lespedeza and endophyte infected tall fescue. Both seen as not that great of species. Well, what we were talking about is the Sericea is high in tannins, fescue is high in alkaloids. Those tannins are binding to the alkaloids. It's a complementarity that's really helping the animals to utilize both of those plant species. And again, something we don't tend to think about, these complementarities and biochemical complementarities in terms not only of primary compounds, energy, protein, so forth, but also these secondary compounds. You know, I interact with a lot of people nowadays across the country, and as people are getting more into plant diversity and the value of plant diversity, and the kind of work that you're doing, Michael, with Gabe and Alan and those folks promoting diversity, livestock producers are finding morbidity and mortality are decreasing when stock or cattle forage on diverse mixtures of plants rather than strictly on monoculture plants. The last example that I'll utilize here is from a friend, Glenn Elzinga, who owns Alder Springs Ranch near Salmon in Idaho. And what he has really gotten into, he raises, quote, grass-fed cattle, which they're eating this tremendous diversity of plants on those landscapes. And several years ago, he read this book, The Art and Science of Shepherding, Tapping the Wisdom of French Herders. And my friend and colleague, Michel Miret in France, was really responsible for it. I helped him as we moved that into an English translation. But what that's about is diversity and how livestock can have to maintain and enhance biodiversity of landscape, but also how when you move animals around landscapes in ways that allow them to create appetizers, main courses, booster stages, diverse dessert phases, these complementarities and so forth, that you can really vastly improve performance and health of landscapes and livestock themselves. Glenn makes the point that, you know, he used to have to provide mineral supplements. He used to have to doctor animals up on the landscape. Said that once he went to this approach and fully utilizing the diversity that's on those landscapes, he provides no mineral supplements. He never has to doctor up there on those landscapes for the kind of things he used to. So this whole idea of the French shepherds then, and it's amazing, and it's far beyond what we have the time, obviously, to talk about. But when a shepherd like this one here looks at a landscape, they're looking at different habitat types on that landscape, and they know how their animals, what preferences are for those. But rather than thinking about, let's just use the best and leave the rest, they are thinking about how do you set up these different courses to the meal so that you can utilize the entire landscape. And it's just phenomenal what they're able to do. Now, I'm not saying everybody should become a shepherd. I'm simply saying that the nuance, the behavioral nuance and insight they have into their animals and how their animals are linked with their landscapes is truly awe-inspiring. And they know that these grazing circuits enable individuals to regulate their intake of primary and secondary compounds. I think last week we mentioned that no two individuals are alike. Every one of us is so unique, and that means that our needs are unique, and that means that diversity enables individuality, and these circuits and moving animals around allows each individual to select what it needs, and it knows it's going to be on this circuit, so it can hold off until maybe it hits the right place for what it wants. That stimulates appetite and intake, and it also, from the standpoint of the health of those landscapes, enables people to target graze to enhance and maintain biodiversity for the health of the entire ecosystem. It's really inspiring what can be done. Okay, Michael, question or comment at this point?
Sure. Yeah. It makes me think what you were saying there earlier about typically you would see grazing animals would eat, say, 3 to 5 species mainly, but a much greater diversity. And it's exactly how we've come to design. Up here where I live, we don't have large rangelands. A lot of our pastures are basically seeded introduced grasses now and legumes, and so it's typically a few grasses and a couple of legumes, right? Smooth brome, meadow brome, some wheat grasses, alfalfa. We have Sicer milkvetch up here now. We have sandfoin as well. We have trefoil, and that's kind of it, right? Some clovers. So 3 to 5 is probably a good. That would be actually considered a diverse mix. A lot of cases here, if it's just hay, it's smooth brome and alfalfa, and we're feeding that to a cow all winter. So we've overvalued the grasses because they grow biomass and high in energy, and overvalued the legumes. They're high in protein, and we've completely ignored the diversity of forbs based and shrubs and the value that they have, right? Because they don't typically, you're not going to get a lot of grazing biomass from a wildflower, right? Basically when we're talking forbs, we're talking wildflowers, but that their value is not so much in protein and energy, but it's in that wide array of secondary phytochemicals that you're talking about. And then those have great value in other ways, like in health and perhaps profitability and efficiency of animal growth and all those other good things that are harder to measure but are equally important. So we're trying to make the point up here and get guys, when they're thinking about sowing down cropland back into pasture, to really think about diversity and try to get some of those forbs back in.
That's perfect, Michael. I'm certainly a cheerleader for that. And next week we'll talk about how that is likely to scale up to really influence the quality of meat and dairy for human consumption as well. So it's not trivial when it comes to the health of livestock. And then, as you were mentioning too, the soil. So you have all these minerals in the soil, and the diverse array of plants is going to probably better enable the pull those minerals out of the soil and get into different plant species. And we've certainly seen that too. If a plant, I mentioned copper down here, if a plant is high in copper, they'll seek it out. They'll select that plant and utilize it. So that diversity and what can happen with the minerals and with the secondary compounds becomes really, really interesting and important as we start to think about moving away from monocultures and the value of diversity for life below ground as well as above ground. Really good points you're making.
Yeah, when I think of diversity now, my kind of simple understanding of this is it's sort of a practical approach that I think can resonate with a producer. Is it's like any profitable organization, whether it's a corporation, a business, a government, whatever it happens to be, you need diversity because different people are good at doing different jobs. So in that same sense, different plants do different jobs in the soil, perhaps feeding different microbiology, or able to uptake certain maybe micronutrients a little better, so everything's doing their job in that system. And when they're not there, when they're absent, those jobs may not get done.
I think you've absolutely nailed it. And when you think about, I wasn't raised on the prairies like you were, and the tall grass prairies and all of, but I've certainly read and I've visited those places. And when you hear, and when you go to places that are reflect the diversity that was in those prairies, it's astounding how the number of plant species that at one time grew in those prairies and helped to create those really rich soils in part, and that then sustained the tremendous herds of animals that were once on the continent.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, we've got two more topics. I know we've gone a little bit long here, but let's finish with these two, if that's okay with you. And
yep, let's do it.
You might wonder, well, skin and gut defenses, what's that got to do with anything? And it's I'm going to wind it around to the practical implications of it. But let's start out with just this general idea. And this relates to all creatures, including we humans, of course. And my first experience with this was many years ago, when we were training livestock to avoid eating particular foods. And the way that we would do that is, it was in the days before feedback was known. And so we were starting out saying, does it exist? And, can it exist for toxins? Does it exist for nutrients? Whatever. This is taking me back many years now to the blackbrush and how naive we were of any of this strikes me. But what we were doing was, we realized that if you put an excess of something directly into the gut, it's going to cause an aversion. That is to say, an animal eats a plant. Say you're talking about trefoil. Say we want to train animals not to eat trefoil. Well, we worked out a lot of techniques that eventually went into practice in different ways. But what we would do is offer the animal the food, and it works best if it's the first time they've ever eaten the food. The more familiar they are with the food, the harder it is to create a lasting aversion. But you offer the food, and then immediately after the meal, you simply dose them with an excess of whatever it is. We used a compound called lithium chloride. Lithium used to be used as a table salt in humans. It's now used for manic depression. And it's very easy to use and very easy to give a little bit of a high dose. When I say a high dose, I want to make clear, after we give a dose, the animals weren't laying on the ground sick. You wouldn't even know they had anything. All you know is the next day when you offer them the food, they turn their nose up. They don't want to eat it. They've probably experienced nausea. We did a bunch of work to show that they probably made them nauseated, and they didn't want the food anymore. But early on, when we were doing this work, when we were thinking about, should we take a balling gun and give them a capsule of lithium, we thought, well, they'll associate that with us, not the food. I don't know if I'm making it clear. Well, we give them the food, we go in the pen after they eat that food, we take a balling gun, stick a capsule down their throat. We were worried they were going to associate the all of that with our grabbing them and giving them the dose of lithium. So the question is, what is it that animals learn when a human administers a toxin? And this is going to lead us into some topics and wind us around to some practical implications. There was a guy I got to know, a psychologist, who did truly groundbreaking work many years before, when I was absolutely a kid. his name was John Garcia, and he developed this idea of skin and gut defenses. And he said all organisms have evolved coping mechanisms for detecting nutrients and protective mechanisms to keep from becoming nutrients, at least too soon. How we all become nutrients sooner or later. So this idea that there's these defenses. And one of the studies that he ran years ago went like this. He offered hawks, he fed hawks black and white mice. But what he showed, when toxicosis occurs after eating black mice, hawks avoid black and white mice, even though they have an excellent visual cue. So the question he was asking is, why don't they discriminate? Here you've got this black mouse, white mouse. And as he'd shown and was showing, it wasn't a question that they can't discriminate colors. They can. This is my attempt at some humor using Farside, who was, I think, great humorist. He said, so the mom's telling, so let's go over it again. You're up about a mile up. You see something dying below you. You circle until it's dead. Down you go. Lenny, which is the one with the glasses there, you stick close to your brothers and do what they do. So anyway, it's not a question of being like Lenny that these guys can't see. They can discriminate very well. So why don't they avoid both of them? And what John was showing is that all cues are not associated readily with all consequences. And this relates to us as much as it does to any other creature. What he was showing is that the taste of food and aversion are strongly associated with what he referred to as the gut defense system, but not to the skin defense system. We don't associate that with skin. Audiovisual stimuli, on the other hand, are strongly associated with the skin defense system, not the gut defense system. In other words, if I touch an electric wire and I get shocked, I'm going to associate that with what just happened. Whereas if I eat a food and get shocked, I'm not going to associate the taste of the food with that shock. Smell goes both ways, as it turns out. If an animal is eating a food, then odor is linked with the food to create this, what we refer to as the flavor. And then if an animal gets sick after eating a food, the smell and the taste are going to be associated with that. But for anyone who's ever hunted before, you know that smell is also associated with the skin defense system and protection against predation. Animals, you're careful to hunt into the wind. You don't want your scent going down below because the animals are going to smell you and they're going to take right off. So that's quick and dirty, but it's just trying to say that you have these two different defense systems that are operating in different ways to create different kinds of association. The skin defense system, now here's this man here that's walking. He thinks that he might see a snake. Now, what happens when at that moment? So the eyes, you have the sight of that possible snake projecting directly back to the visual thalamus. And you don't have to clearly see that. You just have to, think it's a snake. And then that feeds back to the visual cortex, which is involved in the accurate identification of the object. And that feeds back to this part of the brain called the amygdala, which is so involved in fear and fear responses. And that immediately causes an increase in heart rate, respiration, muscular activity. In other words, it initiates this flight or fright kind of defense. So that's part of the skin defense system. And, fear conditioning, fear and these kind of skin defense responses have been shown in every kind of creature from fruit flies to humans. Now, the gut defense system is wired in different ways to accomplish different objectives. Here you have these nerves for taste. And where do they go? Well, they go here to the brain stem and they converge with nerves from throughout the gastrointestinal system. This is part of that critically important feedback system that's going to then, based upon the feedback from primary and secondary compounds, that's going to deliver messages then back here to the brain stem that's going to change liking for the flavor of the food as a function of our need for the food. We could spend a lot more time on this, but that's the big idea there. So there's two kinds of defense systems, skin and gut, two kinds of memories that underlie it. And you were talking nicely about that right off the bat. You have this explicit memory, which is cognitive. It involves parts of the central nervous system like the hippocampus involved in memory. And, example would be for the skin defense system, it would be snake. For the gut defense system, it would be a particular kind of food, sandpoint, or for us, maybe hamburger or whatever. Then you've got this implicit part, and that's the non-cognitive part that you were talking about. Now, we were both saying this, this non-conscious part that feedback's taking place. The amygdala is important there. Skin defense system would be fear. And so you have these two systems getting linked. The side of a snake is linked with fear, and this, and then nausea from the gut defense system from the standpoint of sickness of a toxin, for instance. And so gut defense system, a particular food, and nausea. So you've got these different systems that are operating on different in different ways and through different parts of the nervous system to influence what we learn and remember, and then how those feedbacks occur in this system. So you've also got, let's just make this point. This is the cognitive, rational, analytical part. This is cognitive. This is non-cognitive, intuitive, synthetic part of a system. We could say they're really different in that sense. And this would be the emotional part of the thing, as opposed to the kind of rational part. Rational, emotional part of thing. Cognitive, non-cognitive, and so forth. These defense systems operate on different time frames. The skin defense system operates on milliseconds to seconds. To learn something for the skin defense system, the consequence has to follow immediately. Again, the electric fence sort of thing. If I'm walking out in my yard and I touch my electric fence that I've set up to keep deer from eating our shrubs, if I get shocked immediately, I learn, don't touch this fence. On the other hand, if I touch it and I get shocked 5 minutes later, or even 10 seconds later, I'm not going to associate that. So skin defense system is immediate kind of thing. Gut is different. The gut is integrating and associating the flavor of food with feedback over time frames of minutes to hours. We did studies where we showed you could offer animals a novel food and not administer the toxin until eight hours later, and they still acquire an aversion to the food. It's not as strong as if you give the consequence immediately, but it's still happening. So these defenses are operating on different time frames. And they're also, and this is going to take us to the practical implications, they're mutually inhibitory of one another. I always think of this D-Day, this quote from Kappa on D-Day. He says, the mess boys of the USS Chase wore immaculate white jackets and served hot cakes, sausages, eggs, and coffee with unusual zest and politeness. But the pre-invasion stomachs were preoccupied, and most of the noble effort was left on the plates. That pretty well sums up how this skin defense system, attacking D-Day, that sort of thing, you're not interested in eating at that point in the game. And this has to do then with how these systems are wired and this physiology of stress. And again, we don't have to go into details here at all, but you've got these stress hormones like cortisol. You've got these influences on the immune system and the immune response. You've got this whole hierarchy and linkage of systems related to stress and what stress does. And what we want to talk about here is how stress affects immune responses and animal performance. And we got involved years ago with Ted Turner and the managers of his ranches. He owns 17 different ranches, has a tremendous amount, I think the third largest landholder in the United States, 50, 60,000 bison. And we were working with them. They were very science-based, very wonderful people to work with, and but very interested in science. And at that time, there was, and I think still a bit, but at that time there was debate. Do we want to let bison be bison and try to treat them like they were back in the day when they were free ranging on these landscapes? Or do we want to try to turn bison into cattle? And that particularly came into focus with when they were finishing bison. Do you finish bison out on rangelands? Do you just let them reach finished body condition out there? Or do you put them in feedlots and try to treat them like cattle? Well, they were having a heck of a hard time when they put cattle into feedlots, as they found out. And we were working with them in that days and kind of learning along with them. But when you put bison on total mixed ration, it's not good. They don't perform well on total mixed ration. There's another part to it, though, that goes beyond that. You know, we may have mentioned last week or may not have, but most of these animals, like bison and elk, deer, cattle, sheep, goats, if you let cattle, sheep, goats go feral, they live in extended families. They're matriarchal families. There's a matriarch that's the head of that family. Then you've got all her offspring, female offspring from over the ages, the aunts and the nieces, and on and on and on. So you've got this many generational family. And you also have the young males that are there as a part of that family as well. As the young males age, they break out into bachelor groups, and they separate to a degree from the matrilineal group. Well, that was also shooting people at Turners in the foot, all of us in the foot, in a way that we came to realize. Because what you're doing is taking these young males at a time when they're wanting to separate and have some distance and putting them in tight confinement, feeding them a total mixed ration. And as Mark Kostler describes so wonderfully when he talks about this, it was a disaster. So we're all thinking about, well, what can we do? What are the ways to do it? And one of the studies we ran was bison were fed total mixed ration in tight confinement, offered a choice of feeds in loose confinement, or they allowed to forage on rangelands. And then we were looking at level of stress and performance. And what we found were these things. We found loose confinement had higher average daily gains than the other groups. And they were offering a choice of different foods, not just high grain, but different forages as well. So the bison were really allowed to have some choice to select. But the rangeland group was the least costly to finish and provided the highest net returns. That is to say, they had so much less cost into those bison that the best way was simply to allow them to finish out there on the rangelands. We're working with them now, and we'll talk more about this next week, to look at if you put animals through a feedlot versus allowing them to finish on rangelands, what's that do for the phytochemical and biochemical characteristics of the meat? We'll talk about that next time around. But the bottom line is that living in family groups reduces stress and so forth. And that's what we were showing here. This is tight or loose confinement versus free range. This is cortisol levels. Tight confinement is the highest level of stress. Loose confinement, less stress. Out there free ranging is the lowest levels of stress. The least stressful and most profitable way to finish bison was to leave them on rangelands within their family groups. You know, my colleague and close friend Juan Villalba has gone on to do more work related to that with sheep. And they showed, compared with sheep fed a monotonous diet early in life, sheep fed a diversity of foods and flavors. There's less cribbing, lower levels of stress in those sheep, greater intake of new foods, higher body weight gain. So again, this idea of skin and gut defense systems aren't trivial. Animals are operating off of that all the time. Levels of stress are influencing the responses to the environment, and it's linked with skin and gut defense systems. Which wins us around then to issues with feedlots and total mixed rations. And let me preface by saying, you know, I've known different people who worked in feedlots, people who have run feedlots, people who have spent their careers studying animals in feedlots. And so this isn't meant as some kind of a cocky critique of any of that stuff. It's simply meant as a reflection based on the work that we've done over the years and other people about what happens. You know, there's tremendous morbidity and mortality in feedlots. When you get reading in that literature, even with all the vaccinations, all the things that we've got, it's a tough environment. And it's a tough environment for a whole bunch of reasons that are all related to what we've been talking about. First off, total mixed rations are formulated for the average individual in the group. And no matter how uniform you make them by appearance, they are not uniform by individual. I should have probably put in another slide here of 24 sheep that were offered the simple choice of grain versus alfalfa, and how tremendously those 24 sheep varied from one to the next. Everything from animals that wanted nothing to do with the grain to animals that ate quite a lot of grain, and vice versa on the forage, the alfalfa forage that we were after. The point is, there is no average individual, and when you do that, some animals are going to be over ingesting for their needs. Others are going to be under ingesting. We did some really interesting studies where we offered a total mixed ration versus simply offering the animals a choice of the ingredients, and it was amazing to see the differences. The animals offered a choice of the ingredients that were in the 5 ingredients that were in the total mixed ration. No individual ever selected the same foods from day to day. No 2 individuals ever selected the same diet. But, and so you'd have these individuals just varying from day to day in terms of what combination of foods they would eat. But here was the key point of the whole deal. Those animals that were offered a choice finished as quickly as the animals on the total mixed ration. They graded the same grade. They graded just as well as the ones that were on the total mixed ration. But when it came to the cost to feed them, it cost far less to give them a choice than it did to offer the total mixed ration, because they were either over or under ingesting. Whereas when they were offered even a choice of just 5 foods, they were able to more select a diet that met their needs. So that's a first point with feedlot. There is no such thing as an average animal. When you have animals on high grain diets, I've talked about this earlier, that the grain and the acidosis is causing aversions. We did studies where we were trying to understand, how do animals feel when they're in a toxic state, when they've ingested too much of a toxin. And we did some of that work with grain diets, and we were feeding antiemetic drugs. Those are drugs we take to prevent nausea in humans. And when we had animals on antiemetic drugs, they would eat far more grain from a total mixed ration than when they weren't. What's that telling you? It's telling you that they're nauseated. Those high grain rations make them sick, and if they don't get sick, they'll eat more. But that's not obviously a good situation. I talked just a minute ago about monotony and stress, the high levels of stress that causes. There's some neat studies that show that these animals that are on high grain diets, if you're familiar in the human situation with metabolic syndrome, which is linked with insulin resistance, with high levels of glucose that your body can't absorb, with obesity, with a whole bunch of maladies. That's basically what, when you put animals on these high grain diets, you basically induce metabolic syndrome in those animals. They're not in a healthy state. Then we try to counter all that with antibiotics, which leads to antibiotic resistance. So, I'm sounding really like the big critic, but you can see a whole bunch of issues related to feedlots. And then you get into the whole animal welfare part of things that people are talking about nowadays, and this idea then of diversity and quality and health of animals. I mean, it's not just grain and aversion. When you think of health, you can think about liver abscesses and related kind of of course, metabolic syndrome I'm talking about. The animals aren't in a good state. And then, as my friend and colleague in New Zealand says, and then we eat that. So it's something to think about. And a lot of people are thinking about that nowadays. Well, there's alternatives to all of that. Then, as Michael pointed out when we were corresponding, he said all this, and we make this point, all this is related to animal welfare and the 5 freedoms: freedom from fear and distress by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering. You know, you think you take a young animal, and these animals are sentient, and you take them and wean them, and I'm not the bleeding heart here, but I'm just saying, you take them and you wean them, and then when I was on the ranch, we'd wean them, and then shortly after that, they'd get loaded on a pickup, headed to the sale barn, sold, mixed with animals they don't know. All of that is incredibly stressful on animals, and it's causing suffering, whether you want to call it mental or full body or whatever it is. That's stressful, and then put into a feedlot with creatures they don't know. Freedom to express normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of animals of their own kind. Well, I was talking about space in relation to the bison. Now, company of animals of their own kind, sure, cattle are cattle, but these animals all come to, they learn one another, they know their mother, they know their peers, they know the animals around them. That's animals of their own kind if you get right down to it. When you're thrown in with a bunch of creatures you don't know, think from your own standpoint. You're ripped from your family, thrown in some place you don't know with a whole bunch of creatures, put on the same monotonous food day after day. You're not going to consider that to be animal, any kind of welfare. Freedom from hunger and thirst by ready access to fresh water, a diet to maintain full health and vigor. We've already beat that diet part to death. Freedom from discomfort by providing an appropriate environment, including shelter, comfortable resting area. You know, there again, the location and the diet are questionable in that sense. And then lastly, freedom from pain, injury, and disease by preventing and rapid diagnosis of treatment. Again, all these issues get linked into one another related to health and welfare of animals. And, you know, we know there are some better ways. And I know that Michael is talking and working with a lot of you folks, Michael and Gabe and Alan and many other people are really appreciating and realizing that there are other ways to do this that respect the animals and the landscapes and all the things we've been talking about. So last thing, when toxicosis occurs after eating black and white mice, hawks avoid black and white mice. Pardon me, when toxicosis occurs after eating black mice, hawks avoid black and white mice, even though they have an excellent visual cue. Why? The why goes back to where we began this whole thing. The 2 mice taste the same. Color doesn't matter to the hawk, it's the taste. The taste of the mice is the same, and so they avoid them both because they taste the same. Okay, Michael, questions or comments after that?
Yeah, all right. No, that's, boy, we've gone over a lot.
We have gone over a lot, I know we have.
It's been great. No, I guess one of the thoughts I had in my mind when you were talking about the bison and, you know, one is that they do have a culture, and when you upset that culture by disrupting them, you know, moving them or whatever, taking them off range into a feedlot, you know, it does disrupt that whole as you were talking about. And then I guess the other thought, it was something I think I heard. Oh, who was it? I can't remember at the moment, but he said something like, you know, let the animal be an animal, let a bison be a bison, let a pig be a pig. And in that sense, you know, it makes complete sense that when you let the bison be a bison, there's less stress, like you see in that graph. And then there's also more profitability linked to just letting the bison be a bison, doing its thing.
No, so true. You know, yeah, just absolutely the case. And then you think more broadly to what you've been talking about, and, you know, trying to let plant communities be what they are, and soils and the bison and the wild domestic other animals on that. it sure makes a lot of sense to us at this point in the game, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just like, again, we're not trying to be judgmental, but we're just trying to, this is a 10,000-year-old process of trying to figure out agriculture, and we just continue to progress and have a deeper understanding. And based on that understanding, we try to do better.
Amen to that, and realize that we're just a step in that process as well, huh?
Sure.
That we're trying to do the best we can with what probably very little we know, but to at least try. And thinking, and this is what makes sense to us. I know is nature is a model. It's hard to beat that.
Right.
Nature's been at it for eons, and so trying to, in humility, think about that, and that's what's so, to me, encouraging and worthwhile about all that's happening nowadays. And certainly, as we talk, it can be traumatic to try to first off take on all the new information, and then think about how to even apply that. But you know what's happened to me? I remember we used to teach this 2-week short course, and people would say, okay, we had people who would come back and they'd say, look, it's going to be like drinking out of a fire hose here for 2 weeks. But don't worry, just relax, just come and absorb. And they said, when you go back home, you're going to think about this stuff, and you're going to see it makes more and more and more sense. And you'll be able to figure out how to use this stuff, how to work with it. But they said, first, it's going to be like, and certainly, I mean, we spent 50 years doing this, and it was one aha after the next, and one link you back, and one like, oh yeah, and this, it was amazing. But it can seem a lot. So I'm just going back to a point that you had made when we were talking, and but in the end, I think it makes a lot of sense, because it go back to how's nature been working, and trying to understand and appreciate that.
Yep, exactly.
Well, shall we do this last one and we'll call it good?
Yep, let's do it. Yep.
Okay, so we've been making this case then that these animals have nutritional wisdom, and if you give them a lot of choices, not only can they meet their needs for nutrients, they can self-medicate as well. So then the question comes up, well, why do animals die from eating poisonous plants? So let's take a minute and just talk about that one as a way to wrap this up. I could tell you stories about plants like halogeton here in the Utah area, and 1,000 sheep dying from eating halogeton. I could tell you stories about cattle eating larkspur and dying from larkspur. And I say I've got that wrong there in the bottom. Local weed. Why do animals eat local weed? And let me just take a minute to give some idea of why some of those things happen. Let's spend some time talking about those things. And I want to back up to set the stage on how animals, another layer of how animals learn about things, and then we'll wind our way back to this. This is many years ago now, probably about 15 years ago. This is my wife and our former dog. And she did this just to be funny. I asked her if she'd do that. She's not much of a drinker at all. In fact, she doesn't drink now, but at the time she enjoyed a glass of wine. And she had created this beautiful yard. It's the best place we ever lived there in Utah in terms of soils. We had a 2.5-acre pasture. We raised sheep and cattle that we butchered each year. We had a huge garden. Tons of beautiful plants all around. It was a gorgeous place, and Sue had done a tremendous job of taking a key role in that. Well, in out by the garden, there was this plant that started to grow, and this is a picture of it here. And it was just a teeny little thing at first, and then next year got bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it's a huge bush. We never did get rid of it, and then it's producing these beautiful berries. And I thought I knew what the bush was, but I didn't know for sure. And this one night we're sitting out there on the porch, and I said, "Hey, those berries look fabulous. I'll pick you a bowl full and you can have them." And she looked at me and she said, "Are you freaking insane?" It was near when I was getting ready to retire. "You think I'm going to eat a bowl full of berries that we don't even know what it is? When you're this close to retirement, you can forget it." So um, what what I did, I went and I said, "Okay, they look too good." So I sampled some, but did I eat a bowlful? No, I didn't eat a bowlful. I sampled a couple of them the first day. It was great. They tasted great, and nothing bad happened. The next day, I ate a few more. Same response, tasted great. Nothing happened. Next day, I ate even more. In other words, I was sampling a novel food very cautiously because I didn't know what that food would do. And there's no way I can overstate how much we saw domestic animals do that. How they have this curiosity and caution both, this combination of curiosity and caution, and it varies from individual to individual. But they're cautious of new foods, and that is so, so important. If nutritional state is adequate, familiarity breeds contempt, novelty breeds contempt, and animals are what is referred to as neophobic. That is to say, they sample novel foods cautiously. Now, if they become incredibly deficient, that changes. They'll sample unusual foods. Like I mentioned those sheep eating poop in the pens next to them. They're becoming deficient, and they're eating a novel food more readily than they ordinarily would. But here's just to give a simple example: intake of rice over a 9-day period. And this was part of this short course we used to teach. And this is how much the average animal ate on day one. Hardly any. They sample a little bit, a little more day 2, more day 3, and on and so forth. Then we add a novel flavor to the food, totally change the flavor. Bingo, down they go. This is so smart that they do this. And if you think how this works, here you have mother. That's a model starting in the womb, mother's milk. Mother is a model. But they don't, young animals, they explore their environment. But that's the key. They're starting from a familiar base of foods that moms made familiar to them. And then sure, they sample unusual, novel foods. But then they're able to evaluate that novel food against a familiar base. It's amazing. It's amazingly cool how they do that. And this idea of flavor, and I'll use this to illustrate. I spent a year, and my family and I spent a year in Australia. And I was working with poplar and elm at the time, poplar and elm trees, and doing different studies like I've been talking about here today. And, there was this lot of elm trees there at the place, but there was only or a lot of poplar trees. I'm sorry, a lot of poplar trees at the place, but there was only this one elm tree that was out at this research facility. And, at first it was no problem. I just whacked branches from down lower. But as this study went on, I was climbing like a monkey up in that tree to get branches. Well, at the time, our son was doing competitive swimming. He was in the 8th grade, and I'd take him up to the university early in the morning, about 5 in the morning, to swim. And it's dawned on me one of these days that this avenue I drove up was called Elm Avenue, and it was lined with this very same elm trees that I was feeding in my experiment. So the next day I took an axe with me, lopped a few branches off, giggled my way all the way back to the research facility because I thought this is going to be a breeze. I don't have to climb like a monkey in this tree anymore. Well, I offered that elm from Elm Avenue, and I'm emphasizing it's the same species. It's exactly the same species. But I offered it. Nobody wanted to eat it. This is the novel elm, the elm that's coming from Elm Avenue. And it's probably different in its chemical characteristics. It's growing in a different environment. Remember, we said the environment the plant's growing in influences its chemical characteristics. So again, it just struck me, man, oh man, you introduce the same species but growing in a little different environment. And here they're incredibly cautious of this thing. So I climb back up the tree that same day, whack off some branches, offer them, and here's how much they ate. So it's just another way of saying this novel familiar dichotomy is really important to animals. Well, we did that with meal experiments as well, where we would offer familiar foods. And in this case here, barley, oats, alfalfa, and corn are all familiar foods. The rye is a novel food. That is to say, the first time they ever sampled rye was on day 1. And then on day 2, after they ate this meal of these 5 foods, we gave them a mild dose of this compound lithium chloride that I was talking about. And then the next day, what do we see? They avoid the rye, not the other familiar foods. Now notice corn dips down a bit and then back up. The issue with corn is that they had probably been acidotic on it in the past, so they're already eating a bit less. Then they get sick, their intake of corn drops off. So past experience with the food is influencing positive experience with these 3 foods, negative experience at times with this one. And then here's the novel food. That's really the key here. Following toxicosis, they avoid the novel food, not the familiar foods. So why did cattle in Apache County then, let's wind this back to and end it on some practical examples. Why did cattle in Apache County die from eating poisonous plants while those in Hia County did not? We can think of several reasons that might have happened. We could start just from the landscape itself and say differences in plant chemistry. Perhaps the same plant species were more toxic in Apache County, and you eat the same amount that you were used to eating, and all of a sudden you've eaten too much. We could also tie that in with the mix of plants in the environment. Spent a lot of time talking about how complementarities can influence toxicity of plants like endophyte infected tall fescue or sagebrush and so forth. Maybe some plants that they relied on back in the old familiar environment weren't in the new environment. So now they eat the same amount of plants that they used to ordinarily ate when they had other alternatives that they could mix in. They don't have them, and it leads to toxicity. There's also studies that show the same amount of a toxin administered in a familiar environment has much less of an effect than it does in an unfamiliar, stressful environment. So simply the stress of being in a new environment and eating some of the same foods, that level of stress could have affected them, tying back with our skin and gut defense example. The other thing, and this will blow your mind, but this familiar novel dichotomy enters into here in a really powerful way. We did studies where we would take and we would train animals to avoid a particular food with a mild toxin dose, mild lithium dose in a familiar environment. And then we would move them to a totally unfamiliar environment, offer them foods they'd never seen before, and also offer the food that they were trained to avoid. And which food would they end up eating in that new environment? It would be the one that they'd had the toxicosis with in the familiar environment. That is to say, I guess it's the toxin you know is preferable to the ones that you don't know. But all these are ways then that can explain that we entered into discussion with Mitt Holder about why the difference, why he had tremendous severe losses in Apache County, no losses at all in Hia County. So let's wind it back here then a second and make a couple of points. Halogeton, 1,000 sheep died from halogeton. The issue was simply a management issue. The sheep were trucked in from a long distance away. They were extremely hungry. They were extremely thirsty. Halogeton was the only plant there. And so they ended up eating halogeton. 1,000 of them died from that. You can add in all these things I was just talking about in terms of stress and so forth. And all of that helps to explain lack of familiarity with the food, with the environment, no choice, a succulent little plant. They eat some of it and they end up dying. Let's larkspur, and let's turn here. This is local weed. I'm going to change it on that slide, Michael. But local weed presents a really interesting example that I think is worth mentioning. It's again a lack of availability issue. Local weed is an extremely nutritious plant. It just happens to be high in these alkaloids that'll cause toxicity. But the problem is that the effect is delayed, and that is to say, local weed is mostly an issue in the early spring of the year when it's the primary plant, predominant plant that's available on the landscapes. It also is very high in nutrients, so there's immediate positive consequences from eating local weed. The effects of local weed, the killing of cells in the central nervous system and so forth that occurs with local weed, that doesn't occur for days or weeks later. So you have this feedback trap, what's called a feedback trap, where the immediate positive consequences offset the delayed aversive consequences. And that's what we're going to talk about as we move more into the human part and these ultra processed foods. It's the same kind of deal. You know, I worked a lot with people at the Poisonous Plants Lab in Logan while I was there on plants like larkspur, local weed, whole host of species. And their conclusion was that when you have animals that are, one, familiar with the landscape and have learned how to utilize that landscape in ways that promote health and use plants that could be toxic as therapeutically and medicinally and prophylactically, that there aren't problems. The problems are primarily as a result of management and the way that we end up managing animals and not thinking about how do animals learn about environments and how do we put them in positions that basically hijack the nutrition of their own body. So with that, let's just end on this note that in terms of plants and foraging and all of that business, that these plants that we think of as being nasty or not too good or weeds or whatever, and we can talk more about this as we go, cattle can learn to eat unfamiliar plants and become connoisseurs of different weeds and different species of plants, whether it's using French shepherding kind of techniques or one of the people who worked with us for many years went off and started her own business, Livestock for Landscapes, Kathy Both. Her whole point was how you train cattle to be weed managers to enhance biodiversity. There was also a friend that I had, Jerry Bernetti. If any of you were in the farming and into conferences like Acres USA or that whole important movement, you would have known of Jerry Bernetti. He died of cancer several years ago. But Jerry and I used to correspond during the years we were doing all of our work. And he was talking about the agronomic approach to pastures and how much that had influenced pastures and pasture development and management, and this accent on monoculture. And it was at the time we were talking about the value of all these different species and the chemistry, the secondary chemistry. And he wrote a really nice article based on our correspondence and discussion about, you know, all these weeds that get into your pasture. They're probably really can be valuable for your animals, basically. And then thinking about how to utilize those rather than trying to think about all the fossil fuel intensive ways that we do to try to poison them and get rid of them, thinking about how to create locally adapted animals that can utilize those and how through different combinations of foods, all the things I've been talking about today. And grazing management certainly ties into that. I'm thinking of Ray Bannister here, obviously, in this slide, who ranches out in eastern Montana, and his ideas on boom-bust grazing and training livestock to be weed eaters. And all that was through grazing management. And what we used to talk about a lot, our 6 a.m. visits, is that, you know, is is serviceberry and sagebrush and leafy spurge, are those really problems, or is it just the way that we look at them and the way that we've come to manage them? Can we train animals to utilize them? And we were showing in studies that you could certainly do that. And he took off on that totally. And our whole mantra was livestock can learn to, quote, mix the best with the rest rather than eat the best and leave the rest. And on that note, I know we've gone way, way long, Michael. We can talk about what to do here, but that's kind of a nuts and bolts about let feed be thy medicine.